What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Twink Revolution. I'm Sam.
And I'm Gian, and we're joined with very special guest, Lee Fang, who is an investigative journalist at The Intercept who you've surely heard of if you've been paying attention to anything ever. Welcome, Lee.
Hey, thanks for having me.
No, thank you for being here. So you are a California resident, right? Presumably living under the boot of Commissar Gavin Newsom and the restrictive policies. What's been your take on that, and how's it been for you?
Well, I'm a Californian by choice. I grew up in the DC suburbs, and I love it here. I've been here for 8 or 9 years, and yeah, I live in San Francisco. But yeah, San Francisco by choice, and it's not that great of a city this year during the pandemic, but otherwise, I love it.
What have you sort of found has been your general impression of like the actual sort of government response to COVID here? Because I feel like, the Bay Area was able to celebrate, very, very low rates compared to much of the country, owing to, a cautious and principled approach, perhaps. Well, we could argue about whether it's principled, but at least a cautious approach to reopenings and lockdowns and things like that. Would you say you're sort of generally complimentary of this latest set of lockdowns, or?
Well, I'm not in a position to analyze it like in a really kind of detailed way. Obviously, California has done better in terms of mitigating the number of deaths and hospitalizations as other parts of the country that have been incredibly lax. Part of that has to do with policy. The regional Bay Area county governments and some of the mayors and the governor acting very swiftly in the early days of the pandemic versus other parts of the country that are very loose. But then part of it's also just a factor of our extremely well-educated, high-tech finance workforce that can easily work from home and doesn't need to go into the job at a factory or a call center, which is more prominent in the Midwest or in the South. So, it's a mix. The latest round of restrictions, some of it seems very silly, particularly in LA, where this list of prohibitions that, misdemeanor fines and even imprisonment if you walk outside or take public transit. But then there's gigantic exemptions if you play pickleball or go to a golf course or you work in the television or movie industry, which, is incredible because, that's an industry where people are closely, cloistered and tense in production sense, that it's clearly unsafe in terms of like what the CDC guidelines are. I mean, this is, you look at how people are working in slaughterhouses that, it's similar, and people are packed in together in close quarters. And unlike slaughterhouses, that's at least providing food, although that's a whole nother subject. I mean, a lot of the food that's produced in the United States isn't even used for our food supply. It's manufactured and exported to markets in Asia. But Hollywood, I don't know, we could just watch old movies. We don't need new movies necessarily.
Well, I was also delighted to see that the LA order, I believe, exempted podcasts. So given we're in San Francisco as well, we could have done this in person, coughed all over each other. It would have been great.
Yeah, you guys are biased here, but it's crazy. I mean, I don't know who the podcast lobby is. I think they're just throwing that in there to be modern and hip. But I mean, it's incredible. Like Hollywood, the big tech industries, biotech, they're throwing tons of money at the governor, and bam, you see these exemptions. I mean, the kind of undercurrent here is that there's been a fight over the last 8 months to be counted in these semi-scientific, semi-arbitrary lists. The Department of Homeland Security has their critical infrastructure essential worker list. California has its own version. Some of these counties have their own version. But basically, if you get added to these lists, you get your company and your workforce with some particular criteria gets to stay open when everyone else closes down. And that's been a furious lobbying battle over this year. And we're seeing the kind of fruits of that the last week with Hollywood and some of these other random industries able to stay open. But this is going to really hit ahead on the next few months because they're going to use that same list to determine the priorities for who gets the vaccine first. Because right now the CDC is saying, if you're a healthcare worker, you're phase 1A. But if you're an essential worker, quote unquote, you're phase 1B. And who counts as an essential worker? Well, look at these lists. Maybe it's podcasters.
Well, I sure hope so. I mean, it's. I think what I've found sort of most hypocritical about some of this stuff, right, is like if you were to compare the sort of the U.S. response collectively, which has just been a sort of hodgepodge of different, authorities, but even say California or a sort of county or regional approaches here, it's always been sort of premised either on a sort of like a veneer of scienceism, right? Of saying, at least here's some guidance. We can measure risk or factor in risk in certain ways and try to mitigate spread. However, you could take another approach, which is just like, what is the basics that humans need? And, think about a sort of an approach which is trying to like minimize harm to individuals overall. And that would be about all of their life and, their ability to still live and eat and socialize in safer ways or something. We've done neither of those things, right? We've really just prioritized like whoever can lobby to protect their profits best gets their way, it seems. Is that your read too?
Yeah, I think so. And you just look at San Francisco. We're here in San Francisco. Who's dying this year? I mean, we're seeing an increase in violent crime. We're seeing an increase in deaths from misery. The Chronicle has done an incredible series on the skyrocketing rate of fentanyl and other alcohol-related overdoses. It's something like 500 people in this kind of relatively small city have died already in a documented way from overdoses. That's incredible. That's like, and it's already outranking the number of COVID deaths. So, we have to look at this holistically, but part of this is politics, I guess. Part of it's science. I don't know. And obviously a big part of it's lobbying too, because, these folks don't have a representative. The people who are dying of these deaths of misery, they're not going out to fancy dinners with the governor. They don't have a super PAC, like these people are living in camps. They can't argue for their own material well-being.
Yeah, there seems to be a complete lack of consideration around one's like mental health or like desire to be around another human being. I mean, so many people in SF alone just live alone, which is horrible when the lockdowns were really long. But there's also a lot of policy of like no outdoor dining and outdoor like bars, which it seems to be pretty safe, but they allow like the malls to be open for like Christmas shopping in San Francisco. Just like it seems like people aren't going to take this seriously anymore.
No, yeah. I mean, there's that aspect too. Like the second wave is very different in the sense that people are kind of just tired of being locked down. Some other industries are just like more entrenched. Like it looks like some of the ski resorts will probably be back open, even though that doesn't really make sense, So I don't know. It's a mess.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, this COVID restrictions in general got parlayed so quickly into a kind of culture war. Like, don't look over here at our complete inability to like protect you as citizens or care for you, but instead just like, I don't know, wave some MAGA flags or put up the lawn sign or like. How have you sort of found the response to you in your position as a journalist, sort of trying to formulate a position on this or articulate a position or even commentate sort of these actions?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to just do what I always do, which is, I'm interested in the well-being of society, of individuals and civil liberties and people having the kind of bread and butter basics of housing and healthcare and clean air and civil justice. But, I think there's been a longer term issue that was accelerated this year. People are more and more by themselves in their homes. They don't belong to civic groups. They don't go to church. They don't have any fraternal brotherhood or union that they can join. So they're very isolated at home, and they're finding community in these kind of extremist groups or identity groups on the internet and kind of self-radicalizing and getting angrier and angrier on either side of the spectrum. And it's becoming more and more detached from reality of like, hey, how do we fix just the normal stuff? How do we reverse this inequality, this winnowing out of the middle class? How do we make sure that people can afford drugs and and afford housing and have a retirement with dignity, instead of it's this kind of like this funhouse mirror of society? And all of that's been happening for a very long time. That's not new, of course. But this year, it seems to have gone in the extreme where people sitting at home have kind of lost their mind staring at their computer and then worrying about the future.
Yeah, I think I saw an article about like the QAnon trend and how COVID just accelerated these people who are now trapped on their computers all day, just reading all these theories. And as a result, we see this like mass hysteria around like pedophile cabals in the state, and like everything from like age gap discourse to like a movie from France is like all like correlating to this. Like people have lost their minds, it seems like.
I think people want convenient boogeymen, and for people on the right, it's these familiar canards of like pedophile cabals or whatever, the child trafficking thing, and it's very unifying to have this kind of secret knowledge of how the world really works, that there's the secret government, and there's kind of ancillary versions of this on the left, but the people who have power in society, they're not hidden. Like the chambers of commerce and the people who sit on the boards of directors that basically run the entire economy and set the priorities for our government in terms of policy. I mean, they're all, you can just Google it. They're pretty open. You don't have to look for a conspiracy to understand how the world works.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I feel like so many people have the sense that there is something wrong. I mean, as you say, that kind of hyper atomization and alienation. Certainly, you can't sort of look around and go, "Gee, this all seems normal and well functioning and healthy." But and I think we'll get into a little bit later about the state of journalism in general. But I'm sort of I feel like you're in the unenviable position of trying to sort of like provide better alternative explanations to what's wrong, right?
Well, people, I sympathize with the frustration. People vote, or they march in the streets, or they do whatever, and it doesn't seem to work. I think generally most people, with the exception of certain, I'll just, for this conversation, call them fringe issues, but like for a lot of it, bread and butter issues, basically everyone agrees, but they can't seem to make any change. And the frustration boils over into conspiracy land. And, in addition to just sitting at home and feeling isolated, it's a toxic mix.
I did think it was interesting that I think it's the state level lockdown order, or I guess it's the measures that come into place if certain, rates of COVID are exceeded in a given county, include or exempt protests. As a reason to gather. I thought that was pretty hilarious. It's been one of the strangest pieces of like collective willingness to look the other way. I feel like is that just conversation about specifically say the sort of BLM protests earlier in lockdown that we're all just pretending that that's not a vector for transmission.
Yeah, it's been a little bit shameful. I mean, you've seen this kind of. You don't have to take a position on the content of the protests,
no.
But to see that these conservative protests that happened in Michigan and other states earlier in the year against the lockdown were widely condemned by health officials, by politicians, by journalists, just, demanding the state crack down on these protests. And then within 1 month, in late May, early June, those same individuals, the same journalists, those same health officials, those same politicians were then just euphoric about how those same rules didn't apply to other protests that they sympathized with. And I think that's led to some of this kind of unraveling of trust in public health and some of the CDC guidelines, because to the average person, it might seem arbitrary if you're applying it just based on the content of the protest, not the actual, social distancing or whatever.
There also seems to be like a reveal of like after the Biden victory, the massive celebrations across the country where many weren't wearing masks, many were not social distancing and celebrating and stuff. It kind of showed this group who was very shameful of the poor parts of the country where they weren't wearing masks earlier on, don't actually apply the same logic to themselves, but instead it's a moralistic kind of viewpoint versus like actually solving the issue.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it extends to other areas as well. Like, we've basically taken, just last year, for example, in the New York Times, they did this big spread that was very good journalism looking at how, when you download apps like, whatever gaming apps or dating apps or weather apps, they might seem free, but they're basically what the upsell is that they're collecting all kinds of data from your phone, including like minute by minute location data. And they're selling it to these third parties that then sell it to whomever. And that was the spread in the New York Times last year was a big finger wag, like, hey, let's not do this. And then as soon as the pandemic hit this year, you see the same data brokers working with the same media outlets to shame people for going to spring break or attending religious services or whatever. And then suddenly, once a protest happens that, these gatekeepers in the media or others agree with, then they don't apply the same technology to them, right? Like, it's like, wait a second, wait, when does privacy actually matter, right? Like, well, only when it's for a cause that we agree with. I mean, it's the principles. There just seems like there's no fixed principles here anymore. Everything's just politicized, and it's leading to an erosion of public trust.
Right. I mean, kind of going into like last week's controversy around one of your tweets about defunding the police. You tweeted about comparing it to public school teachers, and that seemed to really ignite the left and the liberals who were furious you would ever compare a teacher to a cop, despite having many similarities in like high social trust in the communities, scandals where unions will protect, criminal acts and stuff like that.
And part of this tweet was ignited by the discourse on social media earlier that day, with President Obama criticizing the slogan "defund the police" and others kind of making the case that it doesn't matter what slogans activists use. This is something that's just by nature of being voiced by an activist, truly virtuous and politically, worthwhile. And, I cover education debates, among many other issues, and the right has for a very long time been antagonistic to traditional public education. They've attempted to cut public ed budgets. They've attempted to privatize public education or voucherize or charterize public schools for a very long time. And the way they go about doing so is to win public opinion. And they do this by creating, property tax organizations that argue for cutting property taxes. They sponsor, some groups that I would call friend groups, but other groups maybe are authentic, but teacher and student associations that call for these policies. They genuinely say that they support, or maybe not genuinely, they at least claim that to support public education, but just, their version of public education. These are all crafted to win the support of the broad working and middle class, and win support of elites, and win battles for public opinion so that it can change policy. I mean, we live in a democracy, a deeply flawed one, but still a democracy. And if you compare that to the defund the police campaign, this is an argument that in many ways just doesn't make sense, right? Like, if you want to reduce the amount of force that police use, if you want to increase the amount of training they have for de-escalation, there's a lot of research that suggests that cops who are overworked and overwhelmed are more likely to use force. So they actually needed to go out and patrol with a buddy in pairs. All of those kind of solutions require more funding. And if we need to fire poor performers or predators on the police force, rehiring and retraining new cops is going to require more funding. So if you compare the defund slogan, which kind of doesn't make sense in terms of what we need to do to increase public safety, or just the behavior, comparing it with the right. The right goes after public ed. They're doing so in a way to win public opinion. The left, when they're working to do something with the police, either dismantle or reform them, they're using the most unpopular possible slogan, and they're taking activities that are clearly unpopular with a lot of average American citizens. Burning buildings, attacking people, burning down working class neighborhoods. So, there's a big comparison in terms of tactics. I've gotten in trouble on Twitter before because a lot of people say you can't criticize a tactic. Well, then to me, it's not a tactic. If it's truly a tactic or, a process, a means to an end, of course it can be criticized or critiqued in some way. If it's like a religious ritual that can never be touched, well, then yes, I've got to silence myself. But if it's simply a tactic, certainly it can be criticized.
Well, and I guess by even sort of wading into this discourse, people would love to sort of ascribe certain principles to you. I mean, I feel like I hope you don't mind me saying. I mean, you are a person of principle who will like, if asked, we will state very clearly what principles you're applying to a situation. It's not it's not hard to discern perhaps like what principle you're trying to consistently apply here. Were you surprised that people wanted to sort of tar you as some sort of like cop loving right winger?
Well, look, I feel like the discourse here is, it's very stilted. I want to humanize everyone in the debate. This feels in a lot of ways like a post 9/11 moment. I'm the person saying, hey, let's try to understand why people in the Middle East are upset with us. If you look at the demands to say, look, we don't like an American military presence in all of these countries in the Middle East. We don't like American military policies in this region. I think we should maybe take that seriously and consider it rather than having a very reactionary opinion here. It's the same situation here. The police misconduct is real. Police racism. There's a lot of evidence that there is racial bias in a lot of police forces around the country, but I don't want to dehumanize them and still turn them into this like comic book villain. I mean, you still want to understand what police actually go through in this country. It's an incredibly dangerous job. It's an incredibly vital job for public safety. We have to think about this holistically. And just look in the last year, something like 60 police officers just in 2020 have been feloniously murdered, either killed by assault with a vehicle or gunned down. And could you imagine if those numbers were applied to journalists or to software programmers or investment bankers? I mean, that would be a gigantic national scandal. But these numbers we're just kind of accustomed to because we know that police officers get killed all the time, and we just kind of have lost our ability to see them as fellow humans.
There also seems to be a disconnect here, and it's funny even as I sort of pose the question. It's interesting that I'm like, I want to phrase this carefully. So there is a disconnect between perhaps the rhetoric around all cops are bastards, kind of that style of protest rhetoric, which I understand is rhetorical, right? And then if you sort of look at any sort of opinion polling about the degree of public trust people have in police, if they're perhaps not like extremely online. What do you make of that? I mean,
look, I think there's a lot of folks who are engaged in this who want to wage a war. They've picked an enemy, but like any kind of war, you're going to have collateral damage. And in this case, we see across the country, police basically pulling back, that they're being told that, any kind of encounter could lead to them being prosecuted and fired. It's easier for them. There's basically no penalties if they just sit in their squad car and play Candy Crush rather than responding to violent crime. And we've seen quite a few studies. One really excellent study from Roland Fryer from Harvard University, looking at earlier kind of protest movements that came out of Ferguson, that came out of Baltimore after Freddie Gray in 2015, when police were widely stigmatized and demonized for those scandals. And what happened was that the amount of policing went down. In Baltimore, it went from he uses a lot of different data points. It's really worth reading the entire study. But just using the available data in Baltimore, for example, they logged the number of traffic stops on a daily basis. It went from 300 something pre-Freddie Gray to after Freddie Gray, it dropped to about 8. Cops in Ferguson and other cities, they stopped doing foot patrols. They stopped responding to crime. In a corresponding way, crime happens to be opportunistic. We saw crime levels skyrocket in both cities, and homicide rates went up by 75%. That's not to say that police shouldn't be protested. They shouldn't be held accountable for misconduct. They absolutely should. But we have to find a balance where the most vulnerable in society are still kept safe. The government not only has a duty to keep bad cops accountable, to prosecute them, but they also have the government has a basic duty to keep our citizens safe. If we shouldn't have to live in a society where if you're having a barbecue or a party and someone comes and shoots it up. There are mass shootings in poor and working class neighborhoods all over this country that never make the news. The media has such contempt for working class communities in this country. Or if they do make the news, it's basically just a copy and paste of the police blotter with no actual investigation of these people's lives. Those people deserve to live in a safe and happy community. And part of that is investments in jobs, in healthcare, in housing, but it's also an investment in responsible, accountable policing. Police that build trust and bonds with the community and respond in an expedient way to calls to 911 and are trained in de-escalation and making sure a community is safe. All of it comes in one package.
Yeah, there seems to be the left in general in the U.S. seems to take a very different take because they don't, and there's not enough trust within public institutions that they can ever actually build that public trust of security in the state. But when you look at countries in like Europe, for example, like I think Denmark, the left wing was fighting the right wing who wanted to cut policing. And they're like, no, we actually want more policing to make things safer. There seems to be a strong disconnect. While like Denmark, no one's being murdered by police in Denmark and they don't have guns. Like they seem to have just given up the fight and I think we should just abolish it versus like make it actually accountable to working class people.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a big disconnect here because I think a lot of the people who are involved in this are not talking to crime victims. They're not going to communities that are completely destroyed by gun violence that, are facing this, because it's difficult to compare us with other Western industrialized countries. They just don't have the same level of inequality and availability of guns and cycles of gun violence that we do. I mean, we're almost on like an El Salvador or Philippines level in terms of gun violence. And those countries also have corresponding high levels of police violence, right? Countries that have massive levels of gun violence have trouble dealing with police who deal with that kind of violence. But even, comparing us to these social democracies in Western and Northern Europe, as a percent of GDP, a lot of these Nordic countries actually spend more on police than we do and have a much lower crime rate. And, people are much happier. They also spend more than we do on prisons, but they have a different type of prison. They have a prison that teaches their prisoners to be more social. That are basically colleges that teach them life skills and skills that they can help reintegrate them back into society. And Norway, for example, has the highest per capita spending on prisons. But again, these are prisons that are actually focused not just on punishment, but on rehabilitation and education. And they have the lowest recidivism rate in the world. So I don't. It's not clear what the goal is sometimes of the left here in the United States. At certain times they don't want to punish. Other times they're demanding people be canceled and fired and punished. And other times they're saying, hey, let's abolish all these institutions that have a horrible history. But then they're not offering a positive alternative or a solution. What do we do with people who go out and commit 5 or 6 gun crimes who murder people in their community? What's the solution to that? I haven't even heard I don't think I've heard the left wing solution to that. What do you do with people who are victimizing people in their community?
Well, and I don't know that you're really allowed to ask that question of people who are, admittedly maybe using a slogan. It's a sloganeering approach to say abolish, defund, whatever. And like I kind of, take people at their word when they say, no, there's more sitting behind this. But I feel like there's never been a real grappling with the idea that like policing under capitalism has a function. And you may not like that function, but it's like something will fill that void. There's no such thing as like, just sort of abolishing the police. It will be replaced. And we've seen instances of this, right, where like private security firms and things like that start getting brought in to fill the gap.
Yeah, far less accountable private security. I mean, there's these new apps that are now taking off where you can pay a monthly fee and get a private security guard. They're growing very rapidly this year. That's the alternative. I don't know if we want to live under that alternative. And a lot of folks have talked about Camden, New Jersey, that got rid of their police force, where it's like, okay, that was destroyed in a wave of austerity by Governor Chris Christie, and then that police force was reconstituted by the larger county in New Jersey that actually had more aggressive policing. It's like, okay, is this what you guys wanted? Because if you actually look at the details of what happened, breaking the municipal police force and then increasing the amount of low-level policing, it fit your slogan, I guess, but that in practice, I don't know if you guys have actually looked at this.
Yeah, I mean, bringing the two issues together is like libertarians. I mean, they support the abolishment of like or defunding of public police, but as well as like education, like in your tweet, like they're the ones who bring these both together. I've seen left people also take that approach, which is this mind blowing. But you kind of got your start by talking about like, as a journalist, talking about the Kochs and their deep connections to Washington and policy. Do you know what their approach has been, or like what they've been involved in recently?
One of them's dead.
One of them's dead, but like, I mean, their foundations and their organizations. What have they been up to? Like, because you don't really hear about them anymore since Trump came into power, because everyone has derangement syndrome.
Well, I started covering the Kochs just because I got my start in journalism around 2008, 2009. And, that was just such an incredible window of opportunity for progressive change. After years of Bush and congressional Republicans, of endless war and privatization and tax cuts, here was one of the largest Democratic majorities in modern history. The first time there was a large Democratic majority without a big Southern conservative wing. It seemed like a lot was possible. Here was this community organizer who had all kinds of lofty promises and rhetoric. And, just going out and reporting on lots of issues, climate change, the stimulus, the bank bailouts, what have you, healthcare, these groups kept popping up out of nowhere. And pulling the curtain a little bit back, we just kept finding so many connections to these two industrialists. Part of it was very material. They simply didn't. A lot of their businesses are in very high carbon fossil fuels. Canadian oil refining, fertilizer. But then part of it was personal. The David, who's now passed away, and Charles are very big self-identified economic libertarians. They really believe that the New Deal was a path to fascism or totalitarianism. They saw the same window for progressive change as kind of a dark moment that they had to stop, and they poured in unprecedented sum. And they worked with some other billionaires and multimillionaires to funnel hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into these political attack groups and think tanks with tremendous success. They helped create a whole lot of new careers on the right, including propping up people like Donald Trump, and really throwing anything at the wall that would stick. And I think there's a little bit of hesitancy, a little bit of regret, because they've seen what's happened. They've gone through a lot of different PR and political advisors, and I think they regret creating the monster that they did in terms of these more, at least in their eyes, monster, because they're so anti-economic populism, but they created someone like Trump, who's both kind of like a vulgar populist and a little bit of an economic populist in terms of his trade war with China, with this refusal to really go after Medicare and Social Security, unlike every other modern Republican. And I think there's been a little bit of regret because they're still dumping lots of money to protect the Republican Senate majority, and they've spent a lot in the elections this year to help Republicans in the House, but they've really shied away from the presidential election, and they're not taking the same kind of assertiveness that they did 10 years ago. So it is kind of a sea change.
Yeah, I mean, just this past election, like I've known many people in the Koch sphere. I was a former Koch libertarian back in my college days, but they all supported Biden because they viewed Trump as like the worst outcome. But no one seemed to be alarmed by this trend that libertarians were rushing to support Biden when, like, it seemed for so long, this kind of the left liberal camp to spend endless years doing like documentaries and stuff, revealing how awful the Koch network and libertarian ideology is. Like, why is no one concerned about this?
Well, I mean, the other thing is that I think part of the guilt and part of their obsession with their public image, as there's been more and more reporting on them funding, the birther people and other kind of folks on the radical right, they felt quite guilty about that, and they try to fund some genuinely positive advocacy around criminal justice reform. But then they've also snuck in parts of that, in terms of changing corporate accountability laws, getting rid of the or forcing mens rea or like showing intent when a corporation is accused of a crime. So it's a mix. But if you look at this kind of the current libertarian set, they're obsessed with the trade war. They're obsessed with getting regulations and government off the back of business, and they see an opportunity with Biden that just didn't exist, especially in terms of the consistency with Trump.
So I mean, I think you kind of, as you alluded to there, I mean, the exposure of these sorts of people through your work and others, did perhaps lead to some actual structural change. I mean, as we think about sort of journalism in 2020, it seems like it's a different world, and obviously the narrative around the death of print journalism and things being what it is, we kind of know that story, but it seems like something's changing still in journalism. I mean, what is your sort of take? I mean, you would list among a very small number of people who are still sort of employed to be investigative journalists.
Yeah, and I'm very fortunate. There are not many opportunities to be an investigative journalist. There are opportunities to kind of feed the polarization machine, as it were, to do kind of clickbait stuff that confirms people's priors, or that basically aggregates what politicians' press releases or advocacy press releases, but like taking the time to dive deeply into an issue and show new information and evidence. There isn't much of that. It's Google and Facebook draining the advertising dollars that have cost, tens of thousands of jobs in the newspaper business. There are, hundreds, maybe even thousands of small towns in America that no longer have a newspaper. A lot of the large institutions that are thriving, the media companies are companies like MSNBC, which is a part of Comcast, or, the New York Times, which, they need advertising dollars, they need subscriber dollars. So in many cases, again, they're kind of reflecting a cultural or partisan point of view, rather than kind of being objective and digging into issues of public importance. So it's awful that journalism is in such a decline. I look to places like Europe and Germany and France, where the government has invested a lot of public money into struggling newspapers. I mean, it's not the perfect model, and I would not be excited to see a whole bunch of PBSs in America. That has its own problem. But they do it much better in Germany. I watched the last series of presidential debates, or at least part of them, there, and it's sober minded. It's issue based. It's not like CNN where they've got holograms and stuff, and they're just talking about what the politicians wear and what kind of hot button issues are touched, and bring in strategists so they just give talking points. They're more talking about the bread and butter issues that I care about retiring and dignity. Can people afford housing? What are we doing about climate change? What are we doing about air quality? What are we doing about healthcare? It's boring, but it's what matters. That's the role of journalism.
Well, and I mean, you have been sort of publicly chastised or challenged, I think, for doing what one might call kind of classic journalism, right? I mean, there's I'm reminded of obviously an interview snippet you did, which you were challenged by a colleague on, and I wonder what you sort of are feeling in terms of the changing composition of the actual industry itself. I mean, it's, as you say, very few roles available. Glenn Greenwald, who you sort of publicly supported, obviously just sort of changed his model of publication. Do you think we're going to see this get any better?
Well, without speaking to any specific Substack or media company,
yeah,
it's going to get worse. It's absolutely going to get worse. I'm lucky in that, there's a small number of very wealthy people who have supported important media institutions, whether that's The Intercept or ProPublica or whatever. But that's not sustainable, just to kind of beg hat in hand to billionaires and hope that they fund the journalism that we need in every community in America. That's why I referenced the German and France model. The public subsidies seem to make the most sense. Maybe we'll come up with something new. Andrew Yang had the kind of idea that we'd have federal fellowships for journalism. There's also been the idea that each American will get kind of like a credit, and then a social credit that they can then, or like kind of like a voucher that they could spend on whatever civic activity in their community, be that a library or a museum or a local newspaper, and the federal government would subsidize that. There's a lot of ideas out there for saving journalism. The direction that's going now, just stuff that's controlled by Facebook and Google, or by billionaires, or this kind of there's now all these partisan media outlets that are funded by the various political parties to influence campaigns. That it doesn't seem viable. I think for superstar writers, they can scrape by on the subscription model. But again, like, who's covering these lower income towns across California? Who's covering Stockton? Who's covering Vallejo? Who's covering these towns that desperately need journalism, that are investigating issues of public importance and really explaining them? There's no future there.
Well, and I sort of wonder about like how much of it's even not just the medium, but the message itself. I mean, it's we're all sort of hyper tuned into a sort of attention economy now, right? And you are it's that model of sort of actual reporting as just another form of kind of entertainment, or as I doom scroll through Twitter or something, like some of its news updates, or I can just go watch another Marvel movie instead of like reading the Chronicle I get delivered or something.
Sure, and I think media also acts as kind of a class signifier too. Kind of by being a reader of certain magazines or online outlets and sharing their content, you're explaining or showing off to the world your sophistication, your literacy, how well read you are. You've got something you can talk about at dinner parties. But a lot of that type of journalism is centered around really just this kind of this cultural liberalism that is very popular among the very highly educated, those who work in high income fields, but doesn't necessarily speak to the reality that so many Americans live through. It's culturally different. It's also disdainful of a lot of American values, of American religion. Stuff that maybe that applies to me too. I'm secular. I'm not someone who's I'm someone who's critical of jingoistic displays of patriotism, but this kind of open disdain for the culture of 70 or 80% of Americans, that doesn't seem sustainable either. If only the media outlets that are thriving now, the magazines and newspapers, are openly disdainful of the cultural values of much of this country that's working class, that's working in restaurants and warehouses. That seems problematic as well.
There also seems to be a worrying infringement of like journalism via big tech in Silicon Valley. I mean, we see so many certain like state medias from places like, I don't know, like Telesur from like Latin America, or like RT, or even like small independent media publications are either getting like completely censored or having special like warnings to make them seem like scary or untrustworthy, while like Fox News or like Radio Free Europe gets like no special warning.
Sure. Or just MSNBC. There's no warning that's done by Comcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it seems interesting, right? That companies like Facebook and Twitter are doing these big pushes, and it is being demanded of them, right? That they essentially are like, we will become the arbiters of truth online. Isn't that scary?
That is scary, and it's clearly, again, it kind of reflects the cultural, social values of a small tech elite and the people in media and in politics who are pressuring them, rather than kind of a principle-based criteria for evaluating all content. Like if you make up stuff on the Democratic side, especially in this last election, if you make claims, or if you post news items that aren't true or don't have evidence to back them, it's very unlikely, if you're coming from a Democratic point of view, to be censored or to be throttled in some way. But they're much more aggressive against conservatives, and that's again feeding kind of a feedback loop of distrust in institutions and resentment in society. I'm nervous about any type of censorship. I don't think there should be overarching efforts to censor anyone. I would rather have more platforms and more journalism. People shouldn't have to turn to Facebook for news about what's happening in their society. They should just have alternatives they can go to. But if the only viable platform is Facebook, I'm nervous that there's so much power being concentrated in the hands of just a few censors.
There also seems to be a left-wing kind of imposed like censorship going on, where people like Bernie Sanders is shamed for going on Joe Rogan, or like Glenn Greenwald going on like Tucker Carlson. Yet the left doesn't want to actually like, they want a voice, but they don't want a voice on certain platforms. Yet have never mentioned like media consolidation or like the Telecom Act, which are like big issues in building a media that actually allows progressive voices. Like, do they not, like, there's a big contradiction going on right there.
Yeah, it's a huge contradiction. And, we saw that a lot of the same voices that were shaming Bernie Sanders for going on Joe Rogan were asking for their candidates to be invited on the same show and were denied. Like some of the Pete Buttigieg staffers were criticizing Bernie for that, but then Rogan disclosed that Pete had asked to go on the show. I mean, it's just hypocritical. I think there's like, the easiest kind of mental shortcut here, rather than dealing with the content of an argument or dealing with the kind of complexity of a policy issue. The mental shortcut is shame by association. by saying, oh, this person follows the wrong person on Twitter. This person has the wrong logo on their t-shirt. This person has, tweeted something 20 years ago or is friends with someone. That's a mental shortcut to invalidate what they have to say. And it happens to work. So that's why you see it so much, but it's not intellectually honest.
Well, Lee, we don't want to detain you too much. We know you are a busy man. There's a small housekeeping issue. Your substantial gay online following just wanted us to convey their well wishes and their love. So anything you're working on at the moment that you want to tell people about, or where they can find more of you?
Nothing that interesting. I've got a few stories, on the back burner, but if anyone has any great story ideas or tips, please send them along.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure we link your Twitter and Intercept home. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's really fun. Appreciate it.